It's a big loss. We're going to talk about Gwen Eifel's life and work throughout the program. We're going to start with words this afternoon from President Obama.
Gwen was a friend of ours. She was an extraordinary journalist. She always kept faith with the fundamental responsibilities of her profession, asking tough questions, holding people in power accountable, and defending a strong and free press that makes our democracy work.
The president said it just right. We're going to talk more about Gwen throughout the program, but first we're going to start the program with what Gwen would want us to start with, the day in politics. The former UN Ambassador John Bolton's name has now been floated into the air as a possible Secretary of State, while the world is still grappling with the meaning and potential repercussions of Donald Trump's first White House staff appointments. Over the weekend, the next president filled the top two jobs of his innermost circle, naming the Republican Party chairman, Reince Priebus, as the White House chief of staff, and Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart and a firebrand figure associated with the alt-right movement, as his chief strategist and senior counselor. Both men are going to report directly to President Trump and be, according to the press release, equal partners in running the administration.
By selecting Reince Priebus, Trump is signaling that he's willing to employ some D.C. swamp dwellers with government experience, even at the highest level of the White House. But the idea of Bannon in that storied place, the White House that is, has unleashed a gush of criticism from civil rights groups, Democrats, and some Republicans who say that Bannon represents the nationalist and at times racist views that Trump should be vocally rejecting. Yesterday, the Anti-Defamation League put out a terse statement calling Bannon, quote, hostile to core American values, and the Southern Poverty Law Center called the pick a, quote, mockery of Trump's pledge to unite the country. Today, in his first press conference since the election, Barack Obama had advice for the president-elect and some tough love for critics of the team that Trump is building.
I've been encouraged by his statements on election night about the need for unity and his interest in being the president for all people. And that how he staffs, the first steps he takes, the first impressions he makes, the reset that can happen after an election, all those things are important and should be thought about. The people have spoken. Donald Trump will be the next president, the 45th president of the United States. And it will be up to him to set up a team that he thinks will serve him well and reflect his policies.
So, Mark, these two choices, obviously big news and have been dominating conversation ever since they were unveiled yesterday. Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon. Talk about the logic of that joint selection.
Well, from Trump's point of view, it's pretty obvious. These are two guys who played as big a role as anyone else in getting him elected. Two guys who are loyal to him, who he feels loyalty to, who he thinks will produce the kind of White House he wants. And the reality is, if you take the two of them and Mike Pence, take away the controversy of Bannon for a moment, it's not a bad setup. You've got three guys with the division of labor to get stuff done who Trump trusts, and Priebus is trusted on Capitol Hill. I think Bannon should speak, Trump should speak about him. By not addressing these issues head on, they're allowing him to be defined in a negative way, and rightfully so. He's got a fuller resume than just his time at Breitbart, but people are alarmed by his association with Breitbart. They're doing nothing to really address it except saying Bannon's a great guy, and I think they're creating a problem that they should address head on. If Bannon's going to be a senior government official, he needs to be accountable, and Trump needs to explain why he's willing to overlook, which he apparently is, some of the most controversial aspects of what Breitbart has done.
Well, not clear that he's overlooking them, more that he may want to embrace some of the more controversial aspects of what Breitbart has done. Look, the argument today coming out of some Republicans, which is, well, you see these incendiary headlines at Breitbart. You can't hold Steve Bannon accountable for every headline that's been on Breitbart. Yeah, you can. You really can. He didn't write those stories and he didn't write those headlines, but he ran Breitbart and proudly trumpeted the notion that Breitbart had become a home for white nationalism and the alt-right. That is by I think most people's point of view, not everyone's, but that is a toxic force in American life and certainly a divisive one. So you're picking Steve Bannon. You're sending a horrible message to large segments of this country about what kinds of attitudes and attributes you're willing to embrace close to the very most, close to the seat of power in the Oval Office. I don't know what Donald Trump could say about Steve Bannon that would make anybody not worried about him, given his history and given Breitbart's history, but certainly not saying anything this is an incredibly controversial pick, the most controversial pick for chief of staff in our lifetime, not chief of staff, but of someone at a senior level at the White House in our lifetime. And it threatens, I think, to undermine whatever modest good Donald Trump has done so far by trying to be reassuring to people. It threatens to undermine all of that with everyone who has the worst fears and suspicions about where this administration is going to go.
And it's not just controversial with partisan Democrats or with the media. It's controversial with Republicans.
Yes.
They need to address, at a minimum, because I don't think he's going to fire him over the firestorm, obviously. They need to address the specific things, the specific headlines. He can say, I didn't write them, but he needs to address them, and he needs to repudiate them if he's going to have any hope of being part of a unifying administration. The guy, as I said, and I've said it in the past, he has a fuller resume than this, but he can't hide behind that. He has to address head on, take responsibility, explain, and denounce the things that people are rightfully really upset about. All right, so as Donald Trump tries out his new role as president-elect, he seems himself, despite the appointment of Bannon, to be toning down more than just his demeanor. During that news-packed interview he did with Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes that aired on Sunday night, Trump was asked about several policy positions he took during the campaign, and on a few, including immigration, gay marriage, and the Affordable Care Act, Trump appeared to soften his past stance.
Are you really going to build a wall?
Yes.
They're talking about a fence in the Republican Congress.
Sure.
Would you accept a fence?
For certain areas I would, but certain areas the wall is more appropriate. I'm very good at this. This is called construction. But
So part
a
wall,
fence would
part
be,
fence?
yeah, it could be. There could be some fencing.
Let me ask you about Obamacare, which you say you're going to repeal and replace. When you replace it, are you going to make sure that people with preconditions are still covered?
Yes, because it happens to be one of the strongest assets.
You're going to keep that?
Also, with the children living with their parents for an extended period, we're going
to keep
very
that?
much try and keep that. Adds cost, but it's very much something we're going to try and keep.
Do you support marriage equality?
It's irrelevant because it was already settled. It's law. It was settled in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's done.
So even if you appoint a judge that...
It's done. You have, these cases have gone to the Supreme Court. They've been settled. And I'm fine with that.
So this isn't unfamiliar. During the presidential race, Trump walked back controversial statements and policy prescriptions at times, often claiming that he had been misunderstood or taken out of context. And in all that back and forth, it never really seemed to hurt his standing in the polls. Today, at that White House press conference, President Obama suggested that shiftiness and flexibility on policy may actually be an asset in the Oval Office.
He is coming to this office with fewer set, hard and fast policy prescriptions than a lot of other presidents might be arriving with. I don't think he is ideological. I think ultimately he's pragmatic in that way, and that can serve him well as long as he's got good people around him and he has a clear sense of direction.
So, John, Trump can go left, he can go right, but when he flip-flops, will he pay a greater price if he does it in the Oval Office than he did as a candidate?
Well, it depends on what he flip-flops on and in what direction. There are many conservatives who did not get behind Donald Trump in the course of the nomination fight in the general election because they didn't believe he was actually conservative at all, that he'd been a Democrat his whole life, that he donated to Democrats his whole life, and that on issues like health care, he was maybe even further to the left than Hillary Clinton in his heart. So one of the things we're going to find out now is how much does Donald Trump actually understand policy, and does he have, forget about ideology that the president was talking about, does he have actual beliefs of any kind about what policies he'd like to see implemented, and what are those beliefs? Because I think there's a fair number of people who think that Trump was just saying all the stuff he thought he needed to say to win the nomination and then to get elected. We're now going to find out if there's a real Donald Trump and who that person is. If he moves to the center in flip-flopping, he's not going to pay a price at all because mainstream Republicans and much of the liberal media will appreciate that if he does that.
I mean, look, if you ask me, does Donald Trump care more about what Gary Bauer thinks or Maureen Dowd thinks? I think the answer is Maureen Dowd. You know, so the question I think is going to be for on most of these issues, is going to be does he pay a price on the right? And I think between Trump and Bannon and some of the other people messaging, Kellyanne Conway, they're going to figure out a way to make people feel good about what's happening, particularly economic conservatives. If they're going to pass major corporate tax reform early on, I think a lot of economic conservatives who don't care much about the social agenda that Trump ran on putatively as a candidate, they'll be like, great, and he will keep a lot of support in the Republican Party. And I don't think social conservatives, very many of them, are going to turn away because Trump will find some way to keep them happy.
Well, of course, that's the concern. When he has to throw those pieces of red meat off to keep the right happy, what are those pieces of red meat and what do they look like and how much do they scare the mainstream? Anyway, all right. The revolting hate speech and hate crimes that have been occurring across this country since the election have not abated. The Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked more than 200 incidents of, quote, election-related harassment and intimidation over the past week alone, targeting African Americans, Muslims, women, and the LGBT community. And yet, Donald Trump, the president-elect who keeps saying that he wants to unite the country, had been silent on this matter until he was asked about it in that 60 Minutes interview that aired last night.
Do you want to say anything to those people?
I would say don't do it. That's terrible, because I'm going to bring this country together.
They're harassing Latinos, Muslims.
I am so saddened to hear that, and I say stop it if it helps. I will say this, and I'll say it right to the camera, stop it.
Mark, you and I talked last week about the obligation that Donald Trump has to speak out against the acts of hate that are being carried out, in some cases, in his name. Was what he said last night on 60 Minutes enough?
Really glad he did it nowhere near enough. And again, I know he doesn't want his transition consumed by doing play-by-play of these horrible things and responding to everyone. But this has been, he has never been Mr. Empathy. He has never been a guy who emotes and talks about these kinds of things in a way that I think the country needs right now. We said it before. It'd help him. It'd help his presidency. It'd help the country. I think he needs to talk more about it, and maybe even some of the specifics, and maybe, as some people suggested, do some symbolic event that would try to send a message that he sees this stuff happening and he doesn't approve, and he doesn't have to be asked about it. He's proactive about denouncing it.
Right. The list, we could sit here, I'm not going to do it, but you could make if you go through this list of these 200 incidents that have been recorded by the Southern Poverty Law Center, many of them are horrifying, and they are horrifying, and many of them are have been carried out by people who invoke Donald Trump's name as they carry out these acts. You know, this is an unprecedented thing. We've never seen, again, anything like this in the wake of a presidential election. And I think, you know, Donald Trump saying, stop it, I'll look directly in the camera and say, stop it, is nowhere near close to the same vicinity of the same universe of enough if this guy wants to actually be the president of the United States and have the respect of more than the people who voted for him. And even some of those people who are probably troubled by what they're seeing play out across the country right now. Got to do more. It's really hard for him because, of course, he ran a divisive and in some cases racist campaign that incited and fostered a lot of this negative feeling that's now playing out across the country. Hard position, but he has got to man up and do more than he's done so far, or this is going to be an ugly, ugly, ugly transition to power for him and for the country.
The campaign's over. There's no reason I can think of to not do it. All right, up next, there's now a Democrat with an inside track on the DNC chair job. We'll talk about who that is and how he's getting to the top in a crowded field right after this. Soul-searching Democrats still trying to suss out the future of their party and the person they want to lead it. When it comes to the next leader, Bernie Sanders has thrown his weight behind the Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. He's also got endorsements from Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, and the outgoing Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid. Today, Ellison became an official candidate. John, there are about 4 or 5 other people eyeing it. Would Ellison, clearly the front runner now, be a good choice?
I think he'd be a good choice. I think he'd be a good choice for a couple reasons. I think, he's clearly now becoming like the unity candidate, a candidate who can get Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders on one side, Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid, who are liberal, obviously, but not like from the far progressive wing of the party. They're piling in behind him. I think the notion of an African American and a Muslim as the face of the party at this moment, at the stark contrast that he would make with Donald Trump. He's a well-spoken guy. He's smart. I think he will be potentially a really good choice for this job.
He brings a lot to it. He's a smart guy. He's principled. He's well liked. I'd question, just because I haven't seen him do it, can he raise big money? Can he go on television and at the highest levels, he's on TV all the time, but can he go on the highest levels and really take on a president? And can he be a member of Congress and also run the DNC? A lot of people like Howard Dean are saying it should be a full-time chair. So I think the guy brings a lot to it. I think he's as impressive as anybody else talking about being in the race. But there's some big question marks about, as far as I'm concerned, about whether he's ready to take that next level up and be the voice of the Democratic Party and the fundraiser for the Democratic Party.
Right. I think those are fair questions. But I got to say, this guy, as we've discussed, could potentially be the face of the Democratic Party going forward. And there will be no more powerful a vision than there's an image of a black man as the counterpoint to Donald Trump if things start to go in a nasty, racially freighted direction in this administration. Very powerful to have him speaking out.
Just say real quick, he's a really impressive guy.
He is.
Very impressive. And there's a reason why these people are coalescing around him.
All right, so we don't have that much time, so I want to get to this topic. Hillary Clinton basically said this weekend to a bunch of donors that she thinks she lost the election because of James Comey and his intervention in the campaign about 10 days out from Election Day. Mark, you think that's true?
I mean, I think it definitely played a role, and I think it riled up Republicans, maybe got some Democrats riled up too. But I think they're being way too ad hoc in how they're addressing this. There are some Democrats who are really angry that she's citing Comey as the main reason why she lost, when there's so many other things that the campaign did not execute on. So what percentage of it is true, I don't know, and I think Comey shouldn't have done it, but I think they'd be smart to have a more organized response because they're leaving a bad taste in some people's mouths.
I agree with that. I mean, did James Comey play maybe in the end, at the very end, a crucial, decisive maybe role? Yes, I think possibly, and as you know, we both agree, he shouldn't have done what he did. It was an inappropriate thing for the FBI director to do, to intervene in this election at that time. But Hillary Clinton, if she showed up with millions of fewer votes than Barack Obama got in 2012, running against a candidate with the liabilities that Donald Trump had, her inability to get the Democratic base out in big numbers, her inability to create the kind of enthusiasm that she needed to beat an eminently beatable challenger in Donald Trump. That is there are many other places to lay blame that have to do with her history, with her past, how she handled the email thing from the very beginning, how she handled it for a year and a half. There's a lot of blame to go around. Comey deserves some, but not all.
Totally agree. All right, up next, our colleague Josh Green, who's a reporter on the Bannon Beat, tell us the latest about what's going on in the Trump transition right after this. Talked earlier in the program about Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's pick for White House chief strategist. Joining us now from Washington, D.C., a guy who is about the only reporter who can get Steve Bannon on the record. Bloomberg Businessweek's national correspondent, our colleague Josh Green. So, Josh, Bannon knows he's controversial. What's in it for him to take such a big job and become the lightning rod in this administration?
Well, I mean, Bannon fancies himself a revolutionary, Mark, as you know. I mean, he thinks that he is helping kind of propagate this right-wing populist movement that swept across the globe, that got Trump in the GOP nomination, and now has kind of swept him into the White House. So I think Bannon views himself as Trump's Karl Rove. And so it's only appropriate that now that Trump is in the Oval Office, that Bannon will be right there with him, advising him on strategy.
So is he doing it because he's loyal to Trump? Is he doing it because he wants to change America? Is he doing it because it's a fun and interesting job? What's the mix of motivations as best you can tell?
I haven't talked about the motivations, but I strongly suspect it's all three of those. I mean, if you look at what Breitbart News has done over the last few years, they've tried to lead this revolution in the Republican Party and drive out the old guard and bring in new people like Trump, and they basically succeeded in doing that. So I think that what Bannon sees himself as doing is, formalizing that victory by taking a powerful role in a White House so that he can steer the country and help a President Trump realize the vision for a different kind of governing agenda than anything we've seen from Republicans or Democrats in the past.
Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Not only have you gotten Bannon on the record repeatedly, but you wrote a long profile of him a little while ago, maybe a year ago or so, maybe a little longer. A lot of the things that the critics of this move are saying is that Steve Bannon's a racist, Steve Bannon's an anti-Semite, that Breitbart is a reflection of those flaws in his character and personality. Is he a racist? Is he an anti-Semite?
I mean, as George Bush said of Vladimir Putin, I can't look into his soul. Maybe I have that backwards. Maybe Bush could look into his soul. I can't look into Bannon's soul. He is a guy who went to Harvard Business School. He was a Goldman Sachs banker. He isn't some knuckle-dragging rube from the backcountry. But on the other hand, he is the chief executive of Breitbart News, which publishes articles that are intentionally inflammatory, that are racially charged, that certainly propagate a lot of racist and anti-Semitic themes, and that is far, far outside the bounds of anything we've seen in mainstream American politics before. And I think what that really does is speak to the fact that Trump, as a presidential candidate and now a president, is so far outside the bounds of anything we've ever seen before. Hard to imagine a guy like Trump being elected, but he has been. Right. And the fact that he has been is in there now. It's really not that surprising that he would surround himself with people like Steve Bannon. Right.
So he's been appointed along with Reince Priebus, who's now going to be the chief of staff. One thing we know about Bannon is that he has often talked about his desire to exact retribution and undermine Paul Ryan and the Republican establishment as much as anything else. So if you're sitting up on Capitol Hill, you're happy about Reince Priebus, but what are you thinking if you're Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell about Steve Bannon and his agenda with respect to the Republican establishment?
Well, I imagine you're pretty nervous. And if you look at the balance of power in the Trump campaign, Bannon, I think, was more of an architect than Priebus was when it came to steering Trump toward an agenda. I mean, I think the two of them worked well together. Bannon has always claimed that they have, and Priebus has always claimed that they have, too. But let's be blunt. I mean, Priebus took essentially a subordinate position to Trump from the moment he became the nominee. That continued throughout the campaign, and my expectation, I guess, would be that that would probably continue in the White House, too, at least until Trump runs into some kind of trouble and feels the need to shake things up.
Josh, what is likely to be the role, a lot of speculation about today, of Breitbart in the Trump administration?
I think that's an open question. And when you stop and think about it, it's a little difficult, I think, for Breitbart to navigate the new terrain in Washington. They have always happily and gleefully been outsiders throwing rocks at the Republican and the Democratic establishment, led by Steve Bannon. And now the fact that Bannon is in there in the White House with the Breitbart candidate and Donald Trump is going to make it much harder, I think, to play that same kind of role, especially if Trump does what he says he intends to do and governs in a way that includes establishment Republicans and even Democrats. It'll be interesting to see whether they wind up playing the same role they have in the past, or whether it's some kind of watered-down version of Pravda.
All right, Josh Green, thanks very much. You can read Josh's latest story on our website at BloombergPolitics.com or in Bloomberg Business Week. We'll be right back.
Joining us now on set is the Democratic strategist and former congressman from Tennessee, Harold Ford Jr. And in our Washington, D.C. bureau, we have the political strategist and I believe still a member, registered independent, or registered libertarian, I believe, Mary Madeline. Great to see you, Mary. I'm going to start with you, ask you this question. How do you think at this moment the president-elect is doing?
I think he's doing great. I mean, what do we have to judge it by? 60 Minutes. I think he made a good decision on Reince as chief of staff, and it's in the Andy Card mold of making the trains run on time. And Reince is particularly connected to Ryan and a very successful governor. Scott Walker, Reince is from the heartland, so he gets the whole Rust Belt, and he's seen successful policies prosecuted in Wisconsin by Scott Walker. So that's good, and I think Steve, I don't know him, but I think he's also a good selection. And from what I hear, the rest is on the list, and I know the court list. Let's go. Let's go make America great again.
Harold, what do you think? There's obviously been a huge outcry about the notion of Steve Bannon, given his pedigree, given the Breitbart's role in coarsening our national political discourse, and in the particular way it has. What do you think about that as a choice, and whether it's unnecessarily provocative?
I would agree with Mary's appraisal thus far. I think as it relates to Mr. Bannon, he's going to have to prove himself. There's no doubt there's a history there with some baggage. This is not Democrats making this up. These are former employees and deputies of his at Breitbart making some of these declarations and even accusations about the company. But I think overall, I mean, I'm disappointed my candidate did not win. I think it behooves President-elect Trump to make clear again, as many times as he can, he wants to represent and serve all the people. It'd probably be good for him at some point to make clear to the country that things that happened during the campaign were things that happened during the campaign, and people should not interpret him as representing that. And he calls on those who are practicing some of these things in his name, calls on them to stop, and then gets on to governing. And again, they've got to prove themselves, and I'm willing to give them a chance to do that.
Guys, as controversial as Bannon has been, if John Bolton really becomes a Secretary of State, it'd be controversial for a lot of people, too. Harold, you first. What would your reaction be if that happened?
Well, I think at that point, you know, I was at church over the weekend, and my pastor was trying to caution people, saying, look, right now we know more about what Donald Trump is against and what he's for, and hopefully we'll find out here in the near term. And if indeed the Bolton choice is made, I think that begins to raise even more concerns as it relates to policy and America's posture around the globe. So I would find that disconcerting. I hope that is not the case. I hope that the 60 Minutes interview and the temperament and tone that he projected there, well, I understand he's going to pick people that not necessarily in my camp, but I certainly want people who not only want to make America great again, but put America first and understand America's role in the world should not always be to insert and to be an interventionist, but to be smart about how we go about doing things.
Mary, I'm hearing Bolton. I'm also hearing Rudy Giuliani as a possible Secretary of State. What do you think of the merits of those two options?
Well, obviously, I love them. Let me say something about Bannon, whom we think we know a lot about his personal history, but what we really need to focus on is his political imperative, what he's demonstrated in this campaign, which happens to echo the same strategic imperative that Bill Clinton and apparently Keith Ellison, who's the top dog now in the DNC race, were absent from this campaign, which is appealing to the marginalized Rust Belt, and to use Bill Clinton's word, rednecks, who have been particularly harmed by Obama policies and have been dismissed by both parties. So that's Steve's strategy, and if he continues with that strategic imperative and trajectory, that's good. John Bolton has said if we lost half the UN, it wouldn't change it wouldn't change our geopolitical strategic imperative. We know what Giuliani did in New York. I was in law school when he came in, and I could actually go back into the city. So John Bolton was there during the post 9/11 when we were having to face a new strategic imperative, which still exists today. I think both of those we'd be blessed if they would join this administration.
I want to switch gears just because, Mary, we only have you for this block, and just ask you both to reflect on someone you both knew well, Gwen Ifill.
Well, Gwen was a sister. She was a girlfriend. She was of the Tim Russert era, and she, as she often said, she's a preacher's daughter, so she always tried to do right no matter what, because somebody was always looking, which is how people of faith behave, and she always did. We're going to miss her a lot.
She was one of the first to accomplish what she accomplished, Mark, and she did it, to Mary's point, with such dignity and grace, and was such a great example to all journalists, but particularly young black men and women, and she never shied away from that. The way she handled this illness here was also consistent with whom she is. I pray for her family and know that we have lost not only a great journalist, but a great soul.
Mary, let me ask you one last question, because as Mark said, you're not going to be on our next block. Is there anything you've seen from the president-elect? I know you said you think he's doing great so far. Are there any things where you think he's not handling this transition particularly well, and advice that you would give him where you're looking at it and saying, you know, you might want to try X, you might want to try Y, it would make your life a little bit easier?
I think the hardest thing for an incoming administration, having been through a goodly number of them, is to keep grounded and don't continue to listen to yourself and continue to hone your discriminating skills, because people are coming at you, and now everybody loves him. Everybody who thought he was a clown and a goof and everything is lining up for jobs. So he'll be getting a lot of advice from people that were otherwise considered very important who are now for him, and he just needs to stay on track, stay where he was, and don't be buffeted around by the kinds of things that have buffeted around and pushed politicians back for the last couple of decades, which has created this Perot, Nader, and Trump and Bernie phenomenon in the first place. All right.
Mary Madeline, thank you for being with us today. Harold Ford, you're going to stick around just because we can't get enough of you. We're going to talk about some of those upsetting reports of violence and hate crimes across the country in just a minute. If you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM, and we'll be right back.
I did say to him, as I've said publicly, that because of the nature of the campaigns and the bitterness and ferocity of the campaigns, that it's really important to try to send some signals of unity and to reach out to minority groups or women or others that were concerned about the tenor of the campaign.
That was more of President Obama from his wide-ranging press conference today, talking about Donald Trump, which was the big topic at the press conference. Since the election, hate crimes and incidents of intimidation have been reported on sidewalks, in schools, and in churches all across the country. Back with us now to talk about this, former Tennessee Congressman, Democratic strategist Harold Ford, and we hope to be joined in a moment from Baltimore by the spokeswoman for the Council on American Islamic Relations, Zainab Chaudhry. Congressman Ford, we talked earlier, John and I have been saying since last week, Donald Trump needs to say more. What would you like him to say if he called you up and said, Harold, what should I do? What should I say? What would be ideal from your point of view to try to address this horrible situation?
Well, I think a lot of what you guys have said over the last few days is, I mean, you captured it, you nailed it. Because everyone who said has not said it, I'll just repeat it. I think him saying, look, the campaign was the campaign. Anyone who believes that things that were said during the campaign, that I'm aligned with people saying that they are for white power, they're for engaging in violent acts against African Americans or Muslims or others in this country, other minority groups in this country. I'm not for that. With a tough-fought campaign, but the campaign is over, and I seek to represent and govern on behalf of the country. He's got to put those in his own words. Again, I thought his tone in 60 Minutes was spot on, but as you guys asked, the selection of a John Bolton, does that mean we're going to bolt from NATO? Does that mean we're going to coddle or cozy up to Russia? I mean, I think that the decisions he makes along those lines are, well, if he does not settle this first part with making clear that the acts of violence and intimidation are not who he is or what he represents, it's going to be harder for him to govern on the other front and the other spaces.
Zainab, how damaging do you think to the national psyche what's going on is now, and what would you like to see the president-elect, if anything, do about it?
Well, right now, there's a lot of fear, I think, and anxiety and concern, especially amongst marginalized or vulnerable minority groups who have been targeted and negatively impacted by this toxic election campaign season. And I think we need a leader who can unite our country, who can bring together, people from both sides of the aisle and calm fears and address some of the core issues that both sides are grappling with. And part of that solution, I think, is specifically appointing top strategists and advisors who do not have a track record of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric that has been, promoted amongst their audience members, like Mr. Bannon's has.
Zainab, let me stay with you and just ask you this question. A lot of people on cable television in the last few days, seeing what's been happening, have suggested that it would be a good idea for Donald Trump to do something symbolic, like go visit a mosque, for instance, to try to extend a symbolic olive branch to the Muslim American community. Do you think that that would be helpful for him to do that, or would that be seen as a kind of token gesture that would do nothing to kind of alleviate concerns that arose out of how he campaigned and some of the proposals he put on the table?
Well, we know last night Mr. Trump did, publicly tell his supporters to stop the hatred and stop the racism. Unfortunately, words have to be backed up with action. And the damage that has been done over the course of the last 18, 19 months won't be undone just by some sound bites. It's going to take concrete action. And I think the message that was sent, especially to immigrants and minority communities across the nation by the appointment of this current top strategist, Mr. Bannon, it sends a signal that he's not ready to unite the country. He's not ready to heal some of the wounds that have been inflicted over the past 18 months. Reaching out to the American Muslim community specifically would be a strong gesture of, or show that he's making an effort to unite the country and, address some of the concerns of the Muslim community, American Muslim community. This has been an especially difficult time for many Americans, but especially American Muslims, in the sense that we have seen an unprecedented level of Islamophobia in the United States during this past 18 months. And just in the days following the announcement of the election results, we saw the number of hate crimes, bias attacks, incidents of discrimination, bullying just spike tremendously, even more than post 9/11. So it's really a concerning time for our communities.
Harold, I want to ask you what you think about what's happening in the Democratic world right now. Obviously, a huge amount of chaos, a lot of recrimination. Keith Ellison maybe going to be the next DNC chair. Just give us a snapshot of how the Democratic Party is coping right now and what the road ahead looks like for your party.
I think there's ambiguity on both fronts. I mean, I think people are hurt, surprised, shocked by what has happened. The reactions I think you see in the streets are not only a reaction to what this young lady so eloquently stated, the kind of climate that exists out there. But politically speaking, there's, the Clinton family has been such an integral part of this Democratic Party. My entire adult life, they have essentially been the leaders. Naturally, President Obama has been president the last 8 years, but Bill Clinton has been such a supersized and outsized influence, rightly so. So as the party thinks about its future, and the Clintons remain an important part of the party, but it's clearly a transition being made. We've got to think about a message. Clinton brought in a message with Mary's husband. It's the economy, stupid, and refocused Democrats on empowering and re-empowering the middle class. Donald Trump was able to do that very well this election, better than our candidate. We've got to zero in on a message and a platform that allows us to do that. I think Keith Ellison he's a friend. He's a very good congressman. I hope that as this process unfolds and maybe he stays in the race, others get in the race, I want to hear the kind of commitment that these candidates are going to have to not only the party, but helping develop a platform and how willing they are to go out across the country, particularly in the Rust Belt, and help to reconnect with voters who, by definition, should be Democrats, because I think our party represents the best chance for middle-class Americans not only to grow, but to see their kids grow beyond their means and grow beyond the state they sit today.
Okay, Harold Ford Jr. Harold, thank you very much. Zainab Chaudhry, thank you very much. Coming up, the Donnie Deutsch, the big-haired and brash man from Queens, the other big-haired brash man from Queens, joins us right after this.
Now for your, it says in this prompter, it says daily dose of Donnie. God, not daily, but at least I hope not. We got Donnie, a daily dose, some dose of Donnie here on set. Donnie Deutsch, my friend, the chairman emeritus of Deutsche Incorporated, and an occasional guest host of this very show.
It's actually the first time I'm a guest on this show.
I believe you're going to be guest hosting at some point in the not too distant future.
Yes, because I understand you're going on your honeymoon. Is that true?
Yeah, funny. My funny moon. All right, so Donnie, you're here because you think that you can make the country feel slightly better. People who are freaked out about Donald Trump, you have some advice for how to calm the situation down.
Here's the cautious optimism, despite Bannon, which speaks for itself. I like to analyze the guy, and there are 4 components this guy has, and I talked about it this morning, that I say, you know what, this might work out okay. Number 1, he is transactional. And we all know what he did during the campaign, and that's not going to be the formula to win as a president. Number 2, he needs to be loved, and he needs to be loved by, frankly, what I'll call the elite class that he ran against, because that's his world. He doesn't want to be booed in New York City when he goes to vote. He doesn't want to be booed when he walks into the poll line. This is a human being. This is just what makes this guy tick. He's also a contrarian, and everybody's expecting him to come in and move far to the right, and in his own way, he's going to kind of flip the bird. And I think the combination of those things, to me, give a certain amount of hope that we might get a surprise there. And his ego. He does not want to go down as Richard Nixon. He wants to be great. He wants to be Teddy Roosevelt. So I look at the man and the motives. Now, once again, you got to caveat that, because now I look at the hiring of Steve Bannon. And the one thing he has to do, and Harold said this, everybody's doing this, my mother would say it, this doesn't take a scholar. He needs to walk things back. He needs to come out. If he is a leader, and if he doesn't do this, then there's no explanation. It's that simple. It's a challenge. There's no other way to do it, to come out and just say there is no room for hate. Absolutely. I'm going to be a law and order candidate against that. And if he doesn't do that, that is a very bad sign. It's an easy one. You could write that speech. I could write that speech. That has to happen.
Donnie, I want to go to the first thing on your list, transactional. If he's dealing with, say, Paul Ryan and conservative members of the House, and he doesn't want to go as far to the right on things as them, what do you think happens then? How does Trump react? How do House Republicans react?
Well, I don't think he's worrying about how anybody reacts as far as within Washington. And I think when I say transactional, it's what is the win? So to him, transactional doesn't mean how do I get this transaction done? How does he get where he needs to get to? And that may be alienating or befriending Paul Ryan. It depends what the situation is. My point when I say transactional is he looks at the goal line, how do I get there? And he gets there.
So, Donnie, why should I, if I'm a voter who's concerned about Trump, you picked a series of personality traits. He's transactional, he's this, he's that. Yeah. Why should I, as a voter, if I'm worried about it, why should I not say, well, he's also a racist and a xenophobe and a misogynist and a confessed sexual predator? Why? Those are things we learned in the campaign. Why should I, again, I'm posturing, if I were that voter, should I focus on those aspects of
because number 1, we can't unvote him. Okay, so I'm a guy who's a former CEO, and I'm trying to rally my organization. And I'm trying to say what he did was despicable. There was nobody who was more anti-Trump than me. But the reality is now, you can't protest from day one. You lose your credibility. You say, prove it to me. I'm from Missouri. Show me. Now, he starts making the wrong series of hires across the board. He does not give that speech. He does not reach out. Then you do it. But the way you are an effective protester, the way you are effective contrarian, is by starting out and going, here, it's yours. And that's what I am trying to do. But he has to walk those things back. You're not effective if off the bat you go, na-na-na, poo-poo, na-na-na, poo-poo. He won. Okay? More people voted for him, at least from an electoral college point of view, and we have to be grown-ups and figure that out.
Just to be clear, I don't think you're saying that these protesters are saying nanny, nanny, poo-poo, but I do get your point, though.
So I actually heard one coming in, and I didn't understand what that meant.
Donnie Deutsch, always a pleasure to have you on the show. I believe you will be back later this week, and we will be right back much sooner with some more thoughts about Gwen Ifill.
As we have discussed throughout the program, America lost one of its premier political journalists today, Gwen Ifill, the host of PBS's Washington Week in Review and the co-anchor of the NewsHour. Gwen was one of the most important, influential, and powerful reporters in the country. She was also a very gentle soul. She started out as a newspaper reporter, including working at the New York Times. Then she switched to TV. Doing all she did as an African-American woman is one of the truly great achievements of journalism in the past half-century. Gwen did what she did with honor, integrity, grace, humor, and passion. She was a mentor to scores and scores of political reporters, including to me. We met covering Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign. She taught me, like she taught so many others, both by example and instruction, that the twin responsibilities of journalism are to tell the stories of our time and to hold all powerful interests accountable to the public interest. And John, I'm certain that she would want all of us to think about how to cover this new president, who has not always showed respect for journalists or the First Amendment or the public interest as aggressively and as fairly as possible.
Well, let alone for African Americans and for women. So Gwen would have been an indispensable voice in terms of covering Donald Trump and holding him accountable for some of his worst moments as a public figure. The two things that stand out to me, I've known her for a long time. I knew her for a long time as well. Was always very impressed with two things about her. I mean, one was that even though she became an iconic television figure, she had the heart and the soul of a newspaper reporter, which is, of course, how she came in. But she was never part of the high and mighty. She never was like a TV pundit. She was always interested in the facts and in being a reporter as much as she was a commentator about anything. And the other thing, of course, is that those elements of her identity, the African-American heritage, the female heritage, in fact, she was a black woman in a rare place of power for someone with that background, infused her outlook and gave her a unique perspective on politics and on life in the nation's capital that really made her an important part of how we came to understand our time in politics and beyond.
We're all going to miss her. We're missing her already. Head to BloombergPolitics.com for more coverage of President Obama's big press conference today. Bloomberg Technology is next. Until tomorrow, John and I will be back then. Sayonara.
I'm Courtney Collins, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your Bloomberg's first word news. President Obama met with press today for the first time since the election of Donald Trump.
We are indisputably in a stronger position today than we were when I came in 8 years ago. My instructions to my team are that we run through the tape. We make sure that we finish what we started that we don't let up in these last couple of months.
Meanwhile, former Goldman Sachs banker Steve Mnuchin has been recommended by Donald Trump's team to serve as Treasury Secretary. That's according to two people familiar with the process. The choice is said to be awaiting the president-elect's final decision. The Securities and Exchange Commission says the agency's head, Mary Jo White, will leave office at the end of the Obama administration. White was appointed by President Obama in 2013, and her term doesn't end until 2019. And a United Nations spokesman says more than 54,000 people have fled their homes because of the military operation to retake the Iraqi city of Mosul from Islamic State. About 3/4 of the people are sheltered in camps set up by the UN. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Courtney Collins. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology is next.
I'm Corey Johnson in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, the post-election tech rout continues as investors speculate what a Trump presidency could mean for Silicon Valley. We'll discuss the outlook for the industry. Plus, Facebook in the eye of the post-election storm. CEO Mark Zuckerberg strikes back at critics who say the social media site swayed the presidential race. And Samsung making an $8 billion bet on connected cars at buying Harman International. More details ahead, but first to our lead. Tech stocks continuing to slide in the wake of Donald Trump's election. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, you know, the FANG stocks. Of course, FANG's Google parent Alphabet, really, but we'll still call it FANG because it sounds better than FANA. But they're all lower today. A forced four-day drop since February for those stocks. Investors are wondering whether President Trump will follow through on some of his protectionist policies outlined by candidate Trump, including a 45% tariff on Chinese imports. The Chinese state-run newspaper responded Monday, writing that the nation would, quote, take a tit-for-tat approach, and that Apple's iPhone sales in particular would suffer a setback. Apple shares down more than 4% over the last 4 days. Joining us right now for some perspective on this, trying to figure out what tech might look like under the Trump administration, Techonomy CEO and Bloomberg contributor David Kirkpatrick, and Winnes Crespi Hart & Company analyst James Chalkmark, who covers Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, among others.
Yes.
James, you had a terrific note out this morning, I thought, about potential impacts. And I just want to maybe take a few of these apart for both of you, and we'll kind of unpack it. So the first thought was, in Silicon Valley, we love immigration. In Silicon Valley, we have so many great companies, from Intel to Google, founded by people from other countries, that we depend on people with H-1B visas to program for these companies. But your take is that it's not going to be the most important thing. Why do you think immigration is not going to be the most important thing for Silicon Valley?
Yeah, we actually think trade, is a bigger deal for that. But when you think about the immigration, what does Trump really want to do? When you hear his talk at the rallies, and ever since he's been elected, is that it's about creating jobs here. And when you think about what the technology industry is doing, they're not actually as much disenfranchising American workers as they are hiring the best of the best. When you look at, the global talent force. And at the same time, when you think about the supply, just simple supply and demand, there's a lot more demand for these technology jobs than there is supply. So that's why we just don't see H-1B visas being as top priority as, some of the other, uncertainties.
David?
Well, my thought when I hear that, because I assume what you're saying, James, is that if he takes his trade actions, Apple iPhones are going to have tariffs put on them or whatever. That's my opinion is that is simply not going to happen, because if he were to take many or even most of the trade actions that he's promised, the global economy, and particularly the U.S. economy, would go into a very discernible tailspin.
Like getting rid of NAFTA.
Just to name one. There's so many things. I mean, this is a very delicate balance. The value of the dollar, who holds our debt, our trade balance in both directions, whether we buy imports or not. If he really messes with that in any direction too much, you risk creating a disequilibrium that really could be very damaging to the economy, damaging to the people who elected him. And I'm sure that he's going to have some relatively smart people whispering in his ear and reminding him of that.
Yeah. A note that was nowhere near as good as yours this morning, but Tony Sacconaghi at Bernstein, and you know, if Tony was sitting here, I'd be talking about how lousy your note was. But Tony Sacconaghi at Bernstein had a really interesting note today where he talked, really focused on taxes and repatriation. And I thought one of his really interesting takes was on a dollar-weighted basis, if you look at the S&P 500 in taxes, that non-tech companies pay a lot more in taxes. Now, to some of us, that's just kind of a duh, because a lot of even S&P 500 companies in technology don't have profits. So, of course, companies like Salesforce will pay less in taxes. but the tax rate paid by non-tech companies, I think we've got a graphic that even shows it, that shows that on a dollar-weighted basis, again, 17.9% is the average tax rate of tech companies in the S&P 500, whereas it's 24.6% of the rest of the companies in there, which suggests that a tax cut won't actually help tech companies. So maybe this sell-off makes some sense. Maybe the rebalancing of an S&P 500 portfolio would have a little bit less tech because it would have less success in a new in a tax-cutting administration.
Yeah, but at the same time, you got to bring the cash back. I mean, we have trillions of dollars sitting overseas, right?
Right.
And if we can do it in a way that's not just done on a single basis, but rather on a perpetual basis, where we know that it's not a one-time stimulus, but a prolonged one. So I do think that there is opportunities, for these companies, because I talk to these companies, right? They tell me that if they had the opportunity to bring it back, they would. Several years ago, eBay tried to bring their $3 billion back, but they couldn't, because everybody was up in arms. Why would you want to pay 40 cents, 50 cents on the dollar to bring this money back? But they have an opportunity.
But that's great.
You know what I mean?
That's great for these companies, though. Yeah. Why should their stocks be dropping if that might happen? I mean, come on.
Well, but the point to that,
and it's great for the American economy.
So which is to say, Wall Street could be stupid here. I mean, if you look at Apple,
that never happens.
Shocker. The company that has the highest tax rate and the most amount of money overseas is Apple. Right. The very company that could benefit the most from this kind of tax rate.
I think that there is an overreaction right now, because there's a lot of uncertainties going on, but at the same time, there's not going to be something to completely destroy everything that's been established. Trade, yes, the focus is to bring back jobs, all the outsourced manufacturing and whatnot, but if it's done with the proper incentives, tax incentives to actually encourage that behavior, it probably will be a lot more muted than people expect.
Yeah, we're in a time of bizarre uncertainty, but that's one thing that's almost certain, is the repatriation of those profits, because both sides really said they were going to do that, right? But if you don't like uncertainty, it is a pretty dicey time. There's no question. But my own view, I am just not feeling apocalyptic. I feel like, I read this great article today by Zachary Karabell, who you probably know, really smart guy, saying, this is the same mood that the country fell into after the election of Nixon, after the election of Reagan. And I remember I was going to leave the country when Reagan was elected. It was that bad. That's the way we felt. And these things settle in, and the republic survives, and probably the tech industry too.
James, you also highlighted some other issues that were.
Yeah, look, I'm optimistic. I'm an eternal optimist.
We're going to have a Dave Chappelle moment right now. We're going to have a Dave Chappelle moment.
It's a good moment to have.
No, that was a good segment, by the way. But there are two things that are on the back of my mind. One is net neutrality, because he hasn't really taken a position on that, because we do want all content to be treated equally. And we know that the Republicans in the House...
the FCC has a really big role here in the FCC.
Right, and it's 3-2 Republican.
Obama.
Right, so if there is a turn of that, actually what that could do is, not only empower the broadband companies, but at the same time potentially increase the likelihood of a Netflix acquisition. And then the second thing is on... jobs, versus robots, is how I put it in the note, is because if you're talking about job creation and we're moving toward an automated world, where everything is being taken over by robots, it could potentially slow down the implementation of technology in general, across industries.
And so on.
Right.
Interesting times. You want them or not, we got them, and I think it is a great mystery to see what's going to happen with this administration. I'm really glad to have you two here. David, you're going to stay with me for some more. James, you're out here. James Chakmok, Vanessa Crosby and Harper. We're still going to see you later this week, and David Kirkpatrick is going to stay here. But for now, thank you. All right, well, staying with stocks, 13F filings been rolling in throughout the day, giving us a look at what tech companies are held by which money managers and which financial institutions like tech, which ones don't. Well, shares of Twitter up after the hedge fund Jana Partners and Highland Capital, both known to be active as shareholders, added stakes to the company. On the other hand, investors are divided on the outlook for Alibaba. One of the early investors, Temasek Holdings, pared its stake on the e-commerce giant. Tiger Global, however, adding shares, notably Tiger, their decision to cut Amazon and double down on Apple. Coming up, Facebook's attempting to come to terms with its huge influence as a news platform after the U.S. presidential election. But how will the world's biggest social media company work to fact-check its news feed, or should it not even bother? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is Bloomberg. Well, another bit of deal news this merger Monday. Google disclosing it bought Undecidable Labs last month. It's a startup focused on turning online searches into purchases. The acquisition suggests that Google's making further moves to make profits out of its massive image library. And remember to stay with us later in the hour. You're going to be hearing from YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki, who once led that Google image search business. Well, right after the U.S. election, Mark Zuckerberg said the notion of a Facebook effect on the election was, quote, a pretty crazy idea. But over the weekend, he wrote a more complex post response, concluding, quote, I am confident we can find ways for our community to tell us what content is most meaningful, but I believe we must be extremely cautious about becoming arbiters of truth ourselves. Economy CEO David Kirkpatrick, who wrote a book called The Facebook Effect, back with me right now.
And to whom he said that it was a crazy idea on stage at my Techonomy conference.
Taking a little bit of that. I saw that happen. Deserved. This gets to the heart of what Facebook has been from the start. Should it be a place where, or even the heart of the internet? Is it a place where people are responsible for what they put out, or is the host of that information responsible?
Well, the bias in the company's history has always been toward the former, a platform for the interaction of its members, basically a platform, the content comes from you and me, right? But I think what's happened is the scale of Facebook's impact on society, the scale of its diversity in variety of services that it offers, it isn't tenable to just be that anymore. And I think they know that at Facebook. But I think there's a little bit of maybe even an existential crisis, like what are we and how do we live up to what we now are? Because it's easy to forget. People love to just sort of badmouth Facebook or criticize them for whatever they do. This is a company with almost 2 billion users globally. That's never happened before for any company, any industry, right?
There's never been a 2 billion person community.
And it has personal data on all those people. It has, all of them are sharing news of all kinds about themselves, about their brother, about their dog, about their country, about the pothole on their street. And, that's a new environment. They have a lot of systems in place. I think they've done a pretty darn good job managing it. but they have to do a better job.
Yeah, it's not just pictures of soup. To that point, with this sound, by the way, we've got a clip from your conference last week where he said this to you. So check out what Mark Zuckerberg actually had to say.
Okay, good.
Personally, I think the idea that fake news on Facebook, of which it's a very small amount of the content, influence the election in any way, I think is a pretty crazy idea.
So I don't imagine he's telling advertisers that the pages that they're advertising on have very little impact and nobody actually pays any attention to them.
Yeah, but it's a matter of the percentage of news stories that were fake is less than 1%. So, I think it's really interesting to ask yourself, okay, if Facebook were the arbiter of truth, how do they do that? Truth is a very hard thing to define.
You have been
many
journalists
instances.
for a long time.
I know. Okay, you know how much fact-checking it would take in a typical Fortune story when I was at Fortune to ensure that it was true? Like 3 days worth, if it was like a 3,000-word story. It's not easy. I don't deny that Facebook has to do much better. I do think they're taking this whole thing gravely seriously, very seriously. They are somewhat taken aback by the pushback they're getting, and they are working to figure out how they should respond because they feel they have to do more. And I think Zuckerberg's note over the weekend shows that.
Well,
but I don't think it's easy.
And there was this great piece in the New York Times this week and also suggested it wasn't just Zuck, right? It was that their senior management at Facebook had kind of a staff-wide freak-out about this where they said, hey, do we need to do something differently? Do we need to radically change the way our business works?
Right.
Because we may have contributed to false information helping people make decisions in the campaign.
Interesting to keep in mind, that's happening at every major news organization also.
Yeah.
And I don't say Facebook is just a media company. That's one of many things they do. If the New York Times, the Washington Post, these places are all freaking out internally. They're getting a lot of pushback from their readers, and they're having an existential crisis because everybody got it wrong, and they're thinking, are our systems somehow wrong that we missed it? So it's not just Facebook. Facebook is the biggest, the richest, the most in your face.
Well, and to the point, some breaking news here from Google. Reuters reporting that Alphabet's Google is working on a policy to update and to restrict ads from being placed on fake news sites.
That's
so to
great.
take away the oxygen that is helping them create revenue. But Facebook isn't doing that.
Well, the kind of thing they might be able to do would get authentication somehow for media properties. So, these people in wherever it is.
Macedonia. This is infamous
Macedonia,
story.
where they're making up news organizations
Let's tell the
and
story.
publishing
So
fake
in
news.
Macedonia, there apparently were a small handful of people creating hundreds of posts that were fake, but were generating a lot of clicks. They were clickbait,
Right.
and they were very popular on Facebook.
Selling ads.
And who made money? The Macedonian guys made money, and Facebook made money off of this.
True. So if it wouldn't be that hard, it seems to me, to have some kind of authentication for media organizations that would prevent that. I think that could be done. And I bet they do introduce something like that in the not distant future.
We shall see. We'll give you credit for that idea when it happens if Alphabet doesn't
I don't
get it
think
first.
it was my idea.
Economy CEO David Kirkpatrick is going to stay with us. I appreciate that. All right, another story we're watching. The U.S. government is going to require new hybrid and electric cars to